Okay, so let's see, we're right here. All right, so um, when we work with students that have learning disabilities, one thing you can call it is cognitive training. That's what the book likes to call it. But it's really just really specific interventions to make sure that we're hitting on exactly what we need them to do. So we have to change our thought process on the way that we teach. So clearly, what we're doing is not working, and we have to think about a different way of approaching their learning. We have to give them strategies. So a lot of the times, your typical students, let's say comprehension, they read it, they understand it, and they score well. That's not going to work for our students with learning disabilities. So we have to teach them strategies, how to highlight keywords, how to stop and look up a word, um, how to sort of take notes on the side of our book to help us remember. There are tons of strategies out there, but sometimes these students have to be taught how to use those strategies, and they have to practice using those strategies because they're not just going to come naturally to them. We have to help teach self-initiative to students. So even if the student gets extended time, you have to encourage that student to ask, like, well, just ask. If you need help, you're more than welcome to ask. I always say that to my college students. If you need extra time to get something in, you have to ask. Don't wait for me to come to you later and say, hey, where's your paper? And then you say, oh, I didn't have it done. Can I have a few more days? That doesn't work. But if you initiate on your own, then that might be helpful. Same for like beginning a paper. When you hand out a paper, you want to help the child learn how to start the paper right away instead of sitting there and um, sort of putting it off because they know it's going to be difficult or whatever it is. And so you have to sort of teach those students how to use skills to self-initiate. And then some techniques you can do, and the book talks about all of these different things in detail, but self-instruction, self-monitoring, scaffolding instruction, and reciprocal teaching. And those are all just really good techniques. But I would reread the book because they've got great ideas on each of those techniques. Some other approaches when you talk about academics and reading, really make sure that you're teaching phonics and teach phonics beyond B says B and T says T. We need to learn how to do like what's split without the ul, what is cupcake backwards, or say cupcake without the cup, things like that. Really go beyond just your basic sounds of phonics. Writing, there's lots of strategies for writing, but we want to teach them to at least get the first couple ideas down, how to correct themselves. There's a lot of different acronyms you can use on your hand, like capitalization, punctuation, comma, grammar, different things like that. If you look up an elementary school thing, they have all sorts of fun, fancy, decorative. Those elementary school teachers are pretty crafty in that way. High school teachers might be too, and middle school teachers, but I spent most of my time in an elementary school, and I know that they came up with all kinds of cool things to do in terms of helping students remember the different things when they were writing. In math, we have to really do immediate error correction, and I think that's the one thing that we're missing when we teach math, is we hand back a worksheet that's wrong, and we just let them put it in their folder. But the problem is then they get into the habit of doing that. So when we're watching a student do a math problem, the second we see they do that mistake, we have to say like, nope, remember we have to add this, or we have to carry it to this place value. We can't carry it all the way over to the hundreds. We have to start at the tens. And so if we catch them right when they do it, they don't get into the habit of the wrong way to do it. And so I think that's the main thing that sometimes we miss in math is the error correction. But we also have to be explicit on how we're teaching it and give very detailed steps. And sometimes you even have to write like on their paper, step 1, this, step 2, this, step 3, this, and sometimes even like visual aids. So I remember when we were doing multiplying, I would have like 4 little lines for the 4 numbers, and then I would have like an arrow up and then an arrow over, and then I'd put like a 0, and then I'd put it, then we go this way, then we go this way, so they could remember, where we start and what we multiply by. And sometimes that visual just helps them to remember. Science and social studies, sometimes we have to enhance the content. We don't want to always be working out of a textbook, which, let's be honest, nobody really has textbooks anymore, but we don't want to always be content heavy. Sometimes we have to enhance the content with videos or just different ways to engage them to help them understand that content. And then graphic organizers and mnemonics are super duper helpful, and especially in subjects where they have to learn a lot of facts or information or compare and contrast or things like that. So definitely make sure that you understand what those things are. Direct instruction is just using a small group, and it's drill and practice, drill and practice, drill and practice. So that's explained more in the book, but a lot of times this is used in RTI, direct instruction. Peer tutoring is awesome. That's where students can work with other students within the classroom. And then service delivery models we talk about a lot of times for students with special or with SLD, they get collaboration or a little bit of resource. So the model of the service delivery model that we would talk about for SLD would often be collab and sometimes resource as well. This we sort of talked about last week about the, this is how we would chart their RTI process. So like on your EasyCBM, you would take this data, and this blue line is what we hope that they do. And so we always want to make sure that we are keeping track of how they're doing. Assess them always. You might want to do informal assessments. That's just throughout the day, different assignments they're doing. And then during accommodations, we want to make sure we schedule the accommodations to make sure that, you know, if the student needs a reader, that we have somebody available to read that test to them. Think about the way that we're presenting our information. If it is a multiple choice or if it's a matching's probably a better idea. Is it easier for them to have the options up top and then the definitions down here, or the options down the side? So think about some of that stuff. You know, we don't want to have like half the options on one page and then half the options on another page. And then the response format. Are we always asking them to fill in the blank, or is it all multiple choice? And so some students just do better with other things, and we have to make sure that we're varying it. I'm not saying you can't give a student one thing or the other. We just don't want to rely heavily on one specific type of assessment, especially if that's not the most preferred way for that student. Intervention, we can't talk about this enough. Earlier the better. The earlier the better. Always, always, always. So as soon as we find students struggling, we should intervene. And the problem that I have is that sometimes we intervene early, but we're not intervening in the right area. So if we're finding they're having trouble with decoding, we need to make sure that that is what the intervention is based off of, those decoding skills. Not fluency, not comprehension, not letter sounds, decoding. And so we need to make sure that we are doing that, because the problem is in preschool, there's not a lot of academic things going on. They're learning how to share, they're learning how to take turns, they're learning how to sit in a circle time, things like that, use their manners. There's not a lot of academic tasks going on. So by the time they come to school, then we start seeing some of these academic delays, and then we have to start intervening. And so we need to think about that. Now, some things you might see at an early age are things like delayed comprehension or expression, so delayed speech, delayed early literacy skills, and delayed perceptual motor skills. So if some of those you see in a preschool, you can start intervening, but a lot of times it's just not happening. And then when we help a student with a specific learning disability transition, either out of school or transition from middle to high, we have to really make sure that they have that perseverance, which is hard. It's not really something we teach, but through our teaching and through our instruction and our motivation and our encouragement, we can teach them to persevere. We have to help our students learn how to set goals, how to accept when they fail, but also accept their strengths and their successes. Allow them to find a network of support and continue to have interventions, give them job training. Really, we want them to be able to take control of their own life. And usually a specific learning disability is not something that hinders you too much, but it is something that you need to learn a lot about yourself. What do you do well with? What do you struggle with? And let's find a job or employment or something or a school that really draws on your strengths, and you know how to ask for help when you need it when it comes to your weaknesses. All right, moving on. ADHD, and we kind of talk about these together because, like I said earlier, a lot of the times they sort of happen interchangeably. ADHD is a little bit different now than you might have remembered it. It used to be ADD and ADHD. Now, under the DSM, they're all one. So ADHD is now all one thing, but there's 3 types. So one type is the inattentive, one type is the hyperactive, and then one is both. So ADD used to be the inattentive, ADHD was the other one. So now it's just all one. So you either have the inattentive type, the hyperactivity type, or the combined type. But the one thing to know is that not all students with ADHD are hyperactive. and that's really confused a lot. We think about 7 to 9% of the school-age population have ADHD. It's not a separate category. It falls under this other health impaired category, OHI. And sometimes the student has ADHD, but it doesn't impair them to the point that it's impacting their academics. So they might have a 504 for accommodations. And so, like we said, and I talked about over and over again, just because you have a disability doesn't mean you need special ed. So just because you have ADHD doesn't mean you need special ed. Maybe it just means you need accommodations. And so if you do need special ed, it's under OHI. If you need accommodations, it'd be under 504. So and boys do outnumber girls in the prevalence of students with ADHD. When you identify ADHD, there has to be a couple of things happening. First of all, you have to have like your typical physical, making sure everything's okay. Usually you have to have some sort of interview. And then there's rating scales. And so the teacher, the parent, or the child can fill out a rating scale. A doctor does not fill out a rating scale. And this is the reason. So I'm going to write down here where they say doctor's office effect. I'll tell you a story. So doctor's office effect is like that one snapshot of that doctor coming into your office. And so one time when my son was younger and he was really sick and he cried and cried and cried for like hours, all night long. We were probably going on like 30 straight hours of crying. And so we finally decided that we needed to bring him into the emergency room. So I bring him in at like, I don't know, 3 in the morning. It was middle of the night. It was awful. And he cried forever. And, you know, by the time the nurses come in, and then other nurses come in, oh, and then I think they had a computer, like, reset for 45 minutes. It was forever, let me just tell you. Then the doctor finally comes in. And the second the doctor walked in the door, that child sat right up and smiled at the doctor. And she was like, look how happy he is. And I was like, no, 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 no. This is not a happy kid. This is a very miserable kid. And she just laughed. And it turned out he did have, I think, hand, foot, and mouth. But either way, that's the same thing happens here. So you might have a child who has ADHD. It is a busy, 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 busy body. But that doctor comes in, and for that 5 minutes, your kid's a complete angel. And you're like, what? This is not exactly the real picture of what my child looks like. And so that's sort of why they don't fill out a rating scale. So the teacher, the parent, and the child sometimes might, and usually the child aspect comes when the child's older, like high school or even college age. But the rating scale includes things like gets out of the seat when he's not asked to, or you know, like there's a whole bunch of them. If you look up the Vanderbilt assessment, there's some the Vineland, those are all both assessments, but seems to run on a mood, or gets upset or gets upset easily. And then usually it's like 1 sometimes, 2 often, 3 always, you know. And so there's a scale. And so what happens is you look at all of those rating scales to see how the child is doing. And sometimes they do better at school than they do at home, and vice versa. The other thing is some observations. So typically a teacher will come into the classroom and just analyze some behavioral observations of the student, and all of that sort of goes together to see if the child has ADHD or not. Once again, the causes of ADHD are neurological, just like a learning disability. So it is a way in which the brain is firing neurons like quickly or not so quickly for the inattentive type, but it's something that's happening in the prefrontal lobes, and it's the child cannot control it. Okay, it's not like they're like, hey neurons, can you slow down a little bit up there? That's not happening. So if you have a child with ADHD, just be patient and know that this is out of their control. They're trying their best, but it's something that's just going on neurologically with them. So there's different neurotransmitters that are involved. It is hereditary, just like a specific learning disability. And sometimes there's toxin and medical factors that could impact ADHD that we think, but we're not exactly quite sure. And I'm going to pause here because we're about at 14 minutes again. So at 15 minutes it turns off. But then we'll talk about our coexisting friends again.